Hello, I am Alex Mabe. I'm at the Medical College of Georgia and now entitled Georgia Health Sciences University. I've entitled this parenting series, Coping Parents and Cooperative Children. This series is designed for parents who are dealing with special needs of their children, whether it's behavioral problems or mood problems, and helping you to think of ways that you can contribute to the well-being of your child, helping them to deal with the special needs that they have. We've learned time and time again that in treating children with mood or behavioral problems, that the provisions of psychiatric care that we have to offer are not enough, that we need parents to be part of the team. And so I want to give you some thoughts on ways that you can do that, ways that you can help your children to learn to be more cooperative and to work on the issues at hand, regardless of whether it's a mood or a behavioral problem. I am a clinical psychologist. I've been around the block a few times. I've been here at the Medical College of Georgia for 28 years. And I have had a lot of opportunity to work with parents on various parenting issues. Now, I'm going to be giving advice, and I always say about advice is fine as long as it's good advice. So how will you know if it's good advice? Well, one of the ways that I judge my advice is whether or not there's any scientific evidence that supports what I'm about to say. Because if there's no scientific evidence that supports what I'm saying, well, it's just my opinion versus someone else's opinion. So I will be saying things that are based on good science, looking at children, parents, how they interact with one another, and what seems to work and what doesn't seem to work. But I'm also a very practical guy, and so I like to make sure that whatever I'm offering in terms of advice, that it's advice that I have tried out myself, either with my own children or have worked with families through the years and have found to be successful. So I'm going to be using those two, and I'll point that out as we go along in this parenting series. I want to start with an introduction of thinking about what it means to be a parent and to get some basic principles down here so that you have a good foundation for how to help your child. Now, of course, being a parent can be very difficult. In the early years, requires constant attention. Children require their diapers to be changed and to be fed and to be taken care of when they're cold, when they're hungry, and so on. And so we're constantly losing sleep and taking on these difficult tasks. As they get older, they begin to have a, quote, mind of their own and can be rather defiant sometimes of what we want them to do, and so we will be challenged by children. They are often self-centered. They do things that are dumb, that get themselves in trouble, cause problems, and of course the more significant their difficulties are, the more work is required of them. And so as parents, it's hard being a parent, and it takes a lot of energy and can be very frustrating. And yet your job is incredibly important, and I want to help you do as best as you can in helping your child. So what is the want to? Why should we want to do this difficult job of being a parent? Well, I like to think of it, and I'm really definitely giving you my own opinion about this, but I like to think of being a parent as an opportunity where I have been given a gift, and it's my responsibility to take care of this gift. It would be like if someone had given you a painting of, say, a famous artist like Leonardo da Vinci, for example, and you've been given this priceless piece of work and you want to place it in your home. Well, how would you treat this priceless piece of artwork? You would no doubt put it in a prominent place, you would protect it, you would make sure that you were taking care of it at all times, you would keep a close eye on it and make sure no one disturbed it or bothered in any way. You would be very diligent in taking care of this priceless work of art. Well, how much more valuable are our children? How much more priceless are they in their value to us? And so I like to think about children as a gift to me, not something that I possess, not something that I can just do what I want to with it, but rather something that I'd want to handle in a very careful, precious way, given their enormous value to me. I also like to think of parenting as kind of having an emotional and spiritual economy to it. That is, the more that I learn how to take care of another person, a child, the more effective I am at taking care of their needs and addressing their issues and problems, the more effective I become in taking care of myself. The science supports that conclusion. As parents learn to be more effective as parents, as they learn to take better care of their own children, they learn to be healthier themselves. they learn how to take care of themselves. And so I think it's important to remember how priceless and valuable our children are, the emotional, spiritual economy of taking care of children. And quite frankly, being a parent is one of the most important jobs that you'll ever have. Who in their later stages of life ever regrets taking care of their children? No, I think very often we'll regret having spent so much time doing other things. But when we have given our full devotion to doing our best for our children, I think that we will look back on our life and feel that we have accomplished something of great value. So for me, those are what motivates me to want to do well. So what is the basic purpose? What is the basic function of parents? What is it they do that is so valuable? And I would suggest to you that the most important role of a parent is to teach the child about living, about teaching them how to handle their life circumstances, their own emotions, their own thoughts. And so I want to hopefully encourage you to think of your role as primarily being that of a teacher. Now, to be a teacher, you've got to be good at instruction. And to be a good instructor, you need to understand the student. And so the child needs to be understood with their unique needs. We want to begin early in life. We want to teach them these lessons as soon as we can. And we want to individualize it to the child. You know, each child is different. Some children are very cooperative by nature. Others are not. Some children are very strong-willed. There are some children who are very standoffish when it comes to new, novel situations. And others, they just jump right in there with no regard for potential danger. Every child has their own unique way of learning. So we need to understand the way they learn, understand their personality style, and adjust and adapt our way of teaching so it best fits the child. Begin early. Remember that each child is different, and make sure that you're adjusting your instructions so that it works for that child. One of the most effective ways to teach important skills in life is modeling. Quite frankly, every lesson that we might teach a child could be interrupted by the statement, "Yeah, but you," indicating that maybe we aren't modeling the very thing that we're trying to teach the child. I happen to believe that some of the most important lessons in life cannot be taught directly, but have to be modeled. For example, honesty. I don't think you can just instruct a child how to be honest if you're not willing to model for that child how to be honest. Have you ever been in that situation? Get a phone call, you don't want to answer it, and you tell the child, "Tell them I'm not here"? What kind of lesson are we teaching the child when we do that? What about personal hygiene? We instruct our children to wash themselves and care for their rooms, and yet if we're not doing a good job with that, are they really going to learn personal hygiene if we're not doing the same things? I believe that learning to love to read is really a lesson that has to be learned through modeling. If the child never sees you learning or reading, are they going to become excited about reading? More often than not, they won't. And so we need to model the important characteristics that we want in our children. Learning to be honest, learning to be nurturing and caring, willing to handle our own emotions with a degree of control and purpose. All of these things have to be kept in mind as we're parenting our children. So we need to be good in instruction. We need to model for them the kinds of things that we want them to do. We also need to have a companionship relationship with the child. You know, in order for children to really learn from us, they got to believe that we really care about them and that we're willing to spend time with them. I'm going to devote a whole session on this important aspect of the parent-child relationship. But I just want to introduce the idea that unless your child believes that you're willing to give them your time, they're not going to be able to learn much from you. So we need to be willing to spend that time, to give them a sense that we not only love them, but we love them enough that we're willing to devote our attention to them on a consistent basis. And I mean consistent. For young children, it needs to be a daily kind of thing. You need to be spending your time with your child on a daily basis if they're a young child. And as they get older, they probably won't want you to be around there every single day giving them your undivided attention. But they will want some special time set aside for that relationship. And so for an older child, it might be a weekly time. And again, we'll cover that in a final series. Last for today's session, I want to talk about using what's called contingency management. In other words, using consequences to teach children how to behave. There are a lot of lessons that have to be learned. How to be cooperative, how to pay attention, how to be safe, how to be goal-directed. There are a lot of lessons that have to be learned, and in order for a child to learn how to do that, we need to shape their behavior gradually over time by the way we respond to their behavior. If we behave in such a way that they are getting the message that when they are doing well, we give them our attention, our praise, and even our reward, then the more that we do that, the more they're going to learn the kinds of behaviors that we want from them. Conversely, if we're not doing that, if we're not paying attention to the good behavior the child's exhibiting, if we're not responding to it, noticing it, praising it, giving them reward for it, then that behavior that we really desire in the child will not gradually grow and develop as we want it to. So we have to be diligent to use our attention, our praise, our comments to give them the kinds of clear consequences for their behavior that we want, so we can teach them the key principles of life. Now, it turns out in parenting research that parents spend a high percentage of their time nagging, scolding, and threatening their children. Now, why is that? Well, let me demonstrate that on the board, why that is the case. So in this little graph, hopefully you can see it, we can see that high means good behavior, and low means bad. And so the question is that I'm asking you is why do parents spend so much of their time nagging, scolding, and threatening their children? Well, when I've asked that question to parents, invariably what they will say is, well, because the child is misbehaving and that I have to nag them and I have to scold them and I have to punish them to get them to behave. And I think that's fundamentally probably the case. That quite frankly that children do misbehave, and parents don't simply aren't coercive just for the fun of it. They're doing it why? To try to correct the child's behavior. The more problematic your child is, the more difficulties they have, the more you're going to feel compelled to nag, to scold, to fuss at them, to punish them for their bad behavior. Some parents have remarked that their own childhood experiences, they learn to nag, scold, and threaten their children because that's how they were raised. Quite frankly, many of us were raised by parents who were very coercive, that they would spend a lot of time nagging, scolding, threatening, and punishing us. And we learned from that. We are now modeling after them the very behaviors that we observed in our own parents. The main reason why children receive a lot of coercive parent behavior is because of this. And the reality is that it works. That if you watch parent-child interactions, and when a parent acts in a coercive way, I'm using coercive in a broad sense of using pain to get your child to behave, nagging, scolding, threatening, punishing, that when you do that, it actually works. And it works pretty quick and works pretty effectively. You don't even have to get out of your chair. You can just sit at the table or sit at your lounge chair and yell at them, and sometimes that can be very effective. That's why we do it so much. And it works very, very effectively. Now, many of you are going, hey, but it didn't work for me. That's because you're anticipating what's going to happen next. Because over time, what happens is that same approach begins to not work. So gradually over time, the child's behavior begins to deteriorate. So the very nagging, scolding, threatening, and punishing that you used at first, that worked very effectively at first, now is no longer working. Well, what's the natural thing for parents to do when something that was working is no longer working? Well, naturally, when you reach this point over here, when it no longer is working, is the parent will often increase the intensity of the nagging, the scolding, the threatening, and the punishing. So they will try again. And what happens when you try again, a little bit harder, a little bit meaner, a little bit louder? Well, what happens is it works. It works. And it works very effectively and works quickly. That's why you do it. You wouldn't do it if it didn't work. If it never ever worked, you would stop being coercive. But the fact is it does work at first. But then gradually, once again, just like the first go around, it gradually stops working. It stops working. So what happens? What is the natural tendency for parents in this predicament? What are they naturally going to do? So the child misbehaves. The parent coerces. The child gets better. Then gradually over time it stops working. So what does the parent do? They ratchet up a little bit higher. What happens then? Child gets better. That stops working. So you can see what's going to happen. Escalating pattern of negative child behavior, increasing levels of coercive parenting behaviors. Now, what's going to happen in this scenario? What's going to happen in this coercive process, as it's called? What's going to happen to the parent-child relationship? Well, eventually, they're not going to like you. They're not going to want to hang around you. They're not going to want to be with you. They're not going to want to talk to you. They're going to have really negative attitudes about you. And although parents still love their children in this coercive process, over time, you begin to not like your child as well. You'll be driving home and going, oh no, another afternoon of nagging, scolding, threatening, and punishing your child, something you dread. And so the parent-child relationship begins to be very significantly disrupted. Well, what happens to the mood of the child in this circumstance? Well, they start feeling anxious, irritable. If it continues on long enough, they'll start feeling depressed. What about the mood of the parent? It's a parallel process. The parent will begin to be irritable, start feeling hopeless, like nothing's going to work, start feeling depressed. What about the mood of the whole family? Eventually the whole family has this negative sense about life at home. Negative, depressing, frustrating. Well, the third thing that starts happening in this coercive process is the child starts learning to be sneaky. They start learning to avoid and escape you. When you ask them about school, they don't have anything to say. They're not going to tell you they got in trouble. If they got in trouble on the playground, or if they're playing with a neighborhood kid and something happens, they're not going to tell you. When you ask them direct questions about something they may or may not have done, they're going to lie to you. Why? Because they want to escape from the coercion. They do not want to have to deal with an angry parent who's fussing, complaining, nagging, scolding, threatening. And so they begin to be sneaky and lie. And the last thing that starts happening in this coercive process is they start modeling after you. So they start nagging, scolding, threatening you. The very behaviors you've been exhibiting, now they're modeling after you. Well, as you can see, a very negative perspective here on this coercive process. Gerald Patterson out of the Oregon Social Learning Center has been studying this very process for the last 40 years. He and his colleagues, and the research is quite clear that time and time again it doesn't work, and there's an escalating pattern of negativity in the parent and child relationship. Well, what's the alternative? If we're not going to nag, scold, threaten, punish, what's the alternative to that? Well, the alternative to that is to use praise and encouragement and reward. Well, it turns out parents don't use that very much. Well, why is that? Well, a lot of parents say, well, you know, the child's not behaving. How am I supposed to praise and encourage them if the child's not behaving very well? And the fact of the matter is your child may not be doing a lot of good things that are easily praised or attended to. Some parents get worried about rewards. They're worried that if you reward the child for every little thing they do, that somehow that will begin to interfere with their internal motivation. In other words, they will not want to do the right thing for the right reasons. There is truth in that, and there is science that shows that if you overdo rewards, it can cause problems. If they get something for every little thing they do, there is a problem there. They will start feeling entitled and feel like they should get something. They'll even start blackmailing you, saying, well, if you wanted me to behave, what are you going to give me? Which sounds like blackmail to me. The research says, however, if you're very careful in using reward in a very targeted way, on a very specific behavior, in a time-limited fashion, the reward does not interfere with internal motivation, helps them to learn the behavior that you want, and over time they will begin to adapt that behavior into an internal motivation. In other words, they will want to do the right things for the right reasons. So to me, reward is more of a dose kind of thing. If you overdo it, if you overdose them with reward, if you indulge them and just giving them things constantly for no good reason, you will mess the child up. However, If you do it sparingly, in the right way, it can be a very effective tool. But you know, all of that is not the main reason why parents don't use praise, encouragement, reward. Here's the main reason. When you track its benefits over time, you can see that it's a very slow process. It takes a long time for that behavior approach to work. In fact, from here at the start to here, when you're just beginning to see small little changes in the child's behavior, this can be as long as 3 weeks. I don't know about your patients, but my patient kind of wears thin after a week or so. And so if I am really diligently praising, encouraging the child, and they're not getting better for 2 weeks, if you're like the average parent, you will give up. You will not try. You realize that, quote, this isn't going to work, and you'll stop doing it. But if you track it, if you go longer, if you persist with that approach, eventually it starts working and works very effectively. And notice that it doesn't wear out like the coercion does. In fact, continues to progress in its benefits. Now, don't get nervous. I'm not claiming that you should only use praise, encouragement, reward to teach children. But I will say this in favor of the praise and encouragement and reward. And that is that when you use a lot of that, what happens to the parent-child relationship? Well, they begin to enjoy being around you. They look forward to those times where you're having conversations and enjoying time with one another. What happens to the mood of the child? It begins to improve. They look forward to spending time with you and start having a more positive attitude about it. And likewise, you also, as you begin to engage in more of those kind of behaviors, it lifts your mood as well. They don't need to be sneaky anymore. They're willing to tell you what's going on. Why? Because they anticipate that most of the time you will be encouraging and praising them. And finally, about 23, 24 years of age, they'll start modeling after you. They'll start praising, encouraging, and rewarding you. That one takes a little bit longer. Well, what am I saying here? What I'm saying here is the research clearly says that if you engage a lot of coercion, a lot of nagging, scolding, threatening, and punishing, that the outcome is going to be very, very predictable. It's going to be like clockwork. It's not eventually, in the long term, going to work. And it's going to create a lot of problems with your relationship with your child, their mood, the overall atmosphere of the family, and the willingness and the ability to handle problems is going to deteriorate over time. What I am saying is you need to bring in praise and encouragement and reward if you're going to be effective. Now, I realize that some children are what are called harm avoiders. If you don't have some kind of punishment or threat, they're not going to get it. And so I'm not saying throw away nagging, scolding, threatening, and punishing, because there is a place for that. And some children need to have that sense of threat, perhaps. What I am saying is you've got to bring in the praise and the encouragement and reward. There's got to be a balance here. Now let me just finish up with this set of research from Baumrein and her colleagues looking at parenting styles. And what the research shows is the parents who seem to have the most effective strategies, seem to have the best outcome. When I say best outcome, I mean performance in school, relationship with peers, cooperation in the home, being good citizens across the board. The parents who are able to produce those kinds of outcomes with the children, they all have something that's in common. They all have effective approaches to nurturing their children, praising, encouraging, rewarding, and effective discipline. Clear rules, clear consequences. And so, in fact, very similar to this graph I just portrayed here, the parenting style research shows effective parents nurture and discipline equally well. There's a name for that. It's called the authoritative parenting style. Nurture and discipline both at high levels. Now, what happens when things get out of balance? What happens when you have, for example, a parent who's very high on nurture but low on discipline? Well, the high on nurture, low on discipline parenting style is going to be a very laissez-faire, indulgence parenting style, and it's going to ruin the child. It's going to spoil them. They're going to feel like they're the center of the universe, and they expect the world to revolve around them. That parenting style creates children who do very poorly once they leave the home environment, where, quite frankly, the world doesn't operate that way. The world's not always going to praise you and just do nice stuff for you. At some point, you're going to have to face up to discipline. What about the other direction? What about the parenting style where they're high on discipline but low on nurture? Well, this parenting style is called the authoritarian parenting style, and that has a very interesting kind of pattern to it. Usually in the first 10 years of life or so in this high discipline, low nurture parents, the child will obey because they're afraid not to. Yes, sir, no, sir. Around 11 years, 12 years of age and up, however, that's when the real problems begin. They'll either go in one of two different directions. One, they'll continue to be obedient, but they will lack a sense of confidence in their own abilities to make decisions. All they've ever learned is how to obey orders. So now when they're facing increasing challenges on their competency, their ability to make their own decisions and do the right thing, they're not prepared. So they often have low self-esteem, they start getting depressed, and they often have difficulties in making their transition into adult years. A more common pattern for this authoritarian, high discipline, low nurture is around 11 or 12 years of age, the child becomes very defiant, very oppositional. They challenge authority at every turn. They're not willing to accept anyone telling them what to do. And so these are the kids who are brought into me by the parents who are just dumbfounded because suddenly the child who was a very cooperative child now is just rebellious at every turn. And that often comes from these authoritarian parents. Well, sometimes you have this situation. You have one parent who's high on discipline, but low on nurture, and they have the other parent who's high on nurture, but low on discipline. Very confusing picture. One parent completely different than the other. And what happens? Well, eventually, over time, the child begins to manipulate the system. They begin to go to the nurturing parent, and they begin to manipulate against the disciplined parent. And what does the disciplined parent do? They increase their coercive approach. They get harsher, meaner. Why? To make up what they perceive to be the indulgent, overly nurturing parent. What does the nurturing parent do? They increasingly get more and more nurturing. Why? To make up for how harsh and mean the disciplinarian parent is. Well, as you can perhaps anticipate, this kind of scenario is very confusing for children, often wreaks a lot of problems in the family. Now, what I eventually want to have happen, of course, is that both parents to come a little closer to the balanced approach of discipline and nurture. I realize personality-wise, parents are going to be different. Some are more inclined to discipline and others are more inclined to nurture, and I understand that, but I need to bring them closer together. But let me just kind of finish up with this kind of summary and stating that to be effective, regardless of what your child's problems might be, you really need to take seriously the responsibilities of being an effective parent if your child is going to get improvement, if they're going to really make progress in their life. You've got to take on the role of instructor. You've got to model what you are trying to teach them. You've got to provide that sense of companionship with them. And last but not least is you need to learn to balance between effective discipline, clear rules, clear consequences, but also nurture. They need to hear compliments. They need to hear praise. They need to get positive attention from you. And they also need to be rewarded now and then for important behaviors they're learning. When you do that, the outcomes generally are positive. Thank you for today, and we'll be picking it right up next session.